normally live up in the Dandenong Ranges. The Dandenongs, I think, is a mispronunciation of Pungarong, which is an Aboriginal word that might mean Misty Mountain. It's a great privilege to be in Melbourne on these lands. Look, I'm here tonight as Brett, not as CSIRO. That probably gives me a little bit more scope to be myself in terms of what I talk about and how I talk about it. Jarnac was reasonably clear, as you would expect from an accountant, fastidious even, in terms of his instructions for me tonight. About 15 to 20 minutes, just cover the great global challenges of health and biosecurity and wellbeing, the maintenance of social license and social capital, but be clear and concise, and maybe just keep it light, maybe a joke or two, and keep to task. So that's my challenge if I choose to accept it. Given that, I might start with my conclusions because it's a useful way to frame everything else that I want to say. And so I want to start with, I think the great challenges of health and biosecurity, indeed, almost all of the challenges of the world, are that all of our problems are wicked. All of our issues are systems issues, and all of our threats are existential. Look, that's a really pithy way of saying it, and it's probably not universally true, but I think it's a really useful framing because I think we're moving into an era globally in which these things are becoming truer and truer day by day. It's not very upbeat yet, is it? I don't have a fourth horse of the apocalypse, for example, but those three horses of the apocalypse are pretty tricky in and of themselves. But we're all deeply familiar with them, and I did debate coming here whether I should speak in a light and optimistic tone or whether I should be blunt and challenging, because we're facing challenges that are literally going to put our global health, well-being, livelihoods, existence under substantial threat. That's a pretty sobering reality. And there is that classic graph of, if you create too much fear, people are paralysed and can't act, and if you don't do enough, they're not motivated enough. But I have seen evidence more recently that actually being a little bit pessimistic about the terrible situation we're in is not the worst thing. Like, we need to have action and commitment from people in a way that we clearly haven't had at a level that's been required over the last 20, 30, 40 years, especially with the existential threats as they are, climate and health at the forefront of that. But I could name biodiversity. We're in the middle of the 6th great extinction in human history, more than human history, in the history of life on Earth. When you have a great extinction only once every 500 million years on average, the fact that we're in one right now should tell us something. Pandemic threats, I don't need to tell you about. I think you're familiar with them. I'm certainly familiar with them. But also the existential threat of artificial intelligence and the broader challenge of dis and misinformation. Again, something I'm overly familiar with, but that is a hugely complex and wicked problem. All of these convergent challenges coming together, that of social media, of political and ideological polarisation, of the ability of generative AI to produce deep fakes. Again, I've seen them of myself. Maybe not a deep fake, it was more a shallow fake of me singing a Taylor Swift song, but nonetheless made me think of just how close we are to a point where, as human beings, we will be in a contestable space about what is real and what is not real, and we will not be able to convince each other definitively what the truth of the reality of the world is, because what is presented to us, and we're already in our little bubbles in social media, we will not be able to definitively say, this is true, this is a fact, this is real, this is our shared reality, and this is a complete and utter nonsense. We've seen it emerge, but I think it's going to be a bigger and deeper problem. What I did want to go to is that they're not straightforward. So a wicked problem is one that is both complex and complicated, but also has the intrinsic elements of unknowability or uncertainty. There's a book, Radical Uncertainty, which I read recently by John Kay, and he refers to that classic Rumsfeld line, the unknown unknowns. And lots of people made fun of Donald Rumsfeld at the time, but he was speaking to a truth. He was speaking to the fact that there are not just the things that we know that we don't know, there are literally unknowable things that we can't find a solution to just by investigating the data, by doing more research, by invigilating the reality of the world. They are beyond our reach, and that puts us in an uncomfortable position. But it also means that what we have is that human judgment needs to still be central to the decision-making we make around the world and how we navigate it. And we shouldn't rely in its entirety on AI, not just because it's rubbish in, rubbish out, but also because it can hallucinate, and also because it works on the basis of data sets and inputs that are known when we're dealing with the reality of a world in which there are unknowable elements, which reminded me of a book I read in the 80s, Gödel, Escher, and Eternal Golden Braid. Fantastic book. I'm not sure I understood it, but it talked about the mathematical paradoxes of Gödel, the self-referencing pictures of Escher and the canons of Bach. So lots on self-perceiving and self-inventing, which is kind of the world of AI now with generative AI. Anyway, that's another story. What I wanted to go to particularly is the great challenge in health of prevention and the deep inaction that I see as a public health physician. Angie, we've spoken about it at length. It is the great challenge of public health. Since that Broad Street pump was turned off and on the basis of the epidemiology of John Snow in the cholera outbreak in London 150 years ago, we've moved a great number of things on the basis of the evidence of a causal pathway, and we've changed the world of public health by virtue of that. Water, clean water, sanitation, vaccination, so many interventions with clean air, etc. But we're now at a point where prosecuting the case for a preventative intervention is harder than it's ever been. And despite the fact that you can go to a public health conference, if I see another presentation that says people who are the poorest and most marginalised in society suffer the worst health outcomes, I will throw myself flaming onto the stage and scream, because it is so well known. And yet we don't see the actions that are commensurate with that challenge. And I'm struck by that disparity. And Hofstadter, who wrote Gödel, Escher, Bach, made up his own law, Hofstadter's law. It always takes longer than you expect, even when you take account of Hofstadter's law. So he's being funny and being self-referential, but it was also, it is the great dilemma of public health. But I think it's useful to understand public health policy making as the ultimate wicked problem. It's complex, it's complicated, and those causal pathways are multidimensional. They have long latency periods, they have lag times. That means that if you take an action, you don't see a result in the near term, and you can't be absolutely sure about the thing that you've changed being responsible for the change that you see. And that's a really enormous challenge for policymakers. What we do see is this huge, sometimes complete gap between the rhetoric, the high rhetoric, and the action and delivery. It's tempting to assume that the high rhetoric, especially in the political world, relates just to low will, or that we are failing as public health people in our narrative, that there's a deeply inadequate narrative, and that we can't make the value proposition. And again, we've tried to tackle with this. We've put the argument in a dozen different ways through our budget application processes in Victoria and elsewhere. But I'm not sure either of these are true. I think politicians actually go in with high rhetoric and high will, but the implementation challenges fail them for a whole bunch of complex reasons. I think our narratives can be very compelling, but it's not the problem of inadequate, compelling narrative that means that we're not getting the actions. Why do politicians make these promises? Everyone says prevention is better than cure. It's kind of an intuitive, unchallenged notion that prevention is of huge and high value and that we should all be doing it. And they make those commitments. They make them as pre-election commitments. They make them in the course of their political careers. I think that they don't think that it's impossible that we can achieve prevention as a really primary focus. I think they come into office and they face the major obstacles in implementation. And it's for a few reasons. They either commit to that vague policy notion of let's put prevention first, prevention in mental health, prevention in whatever, before they really understand what it means. And then when they understand what it means, it becomes a secondary priority because those front page news stories of the ambulance ramping and the wait times in ED or the waiting list for knee replacements become the pressing and urgent and immediate need that they must respond to because those are the KPIs that they must respond to. They have a direct and unequivocal accountability for those things. There's no commissar for prevention who holds all the responsibility for making sure that those primary or primordial interventions are made. And the third reason is that they try to deliver governance reforms over a complex policy-making environment. And that complex environment is sometimes because even the definition of prevention is not well understood. Sometimes they're talking about early intervention. I think that's classically what bureaucrats talk about when they talk about prevention. But actually there's this whole spectrum: primordial prevention, addressing poverty as an absolute and unequivocal root cause, or primary prevention like vaccination, or secondary prevention like regular antibiotics, or tertiary prevention, which is the early intervention piece. The other big issues at play, there's competition for money. The benefits are hard to measure. We never land the metrics, and Treasury works on metrics, and KPIs are the lifeblood for bureaucrats who need to be accountable to their political masters, and that's troublesome. The problems are genuinely wicked, so those causal pathways are not linear, they're not one-dimensional, they have multiple inputs and multiple kind of sensitivities to external and other factors. And so you can change one thing and it shifts everything, and you can't have that direct accountability. And then there's, of course, the philosophy of government intervention. We've all heard about the arguments over the nanny state. And so there's this genuine ideological question of how much should government lean in, even when they know what things look like, because we're sovereign individuals, we've got agency, and should you be interfering even if you know that you'll get an outcome by virtue of that? The inventor of the term nanny state was a peer in the UK House of Lords. Needless to say, he developed lung cancer, lifelong smoker, and yes, he used the universal healthcare of the NHS in the UK for his care, but he was an absolute advocate of, if I want to smoke, I'm going to damn well smoke. And I think that still sits comfortably with people, despite the fact that we have to make decisions for populations, but we also have to have this nuanced conversation about who misses out here. You've got to constrain something in order to provide liberty to others, or you have to accept that there's a cost by virtue of doing so that is borne by all of us in one way or another as taxpayers. And evidence doesn't always settle the question, because of these unknowable elements, but also because of these really complex and complicated pathways. And then there's the final issue of who's accountable. Tobacco worked because it was pretty straight line. Smoking caused lung cancer. Lung cancer was a huge cost to the individual, to the society, to the healthcare system. Almost nothing else caused lung cancer. Tobacco produced almost nothing of value except for tax revenue. And so it was reasonably straightforward. But if you're making an argument about something more complex, like intervening on sedentary behaviour or obesity, it's all the systems issues at play. Coca-Cola, Amatil have their stake in the game, let's face it. And there are billions and billions of dollars at play. Walmart has a bigger GDP equivalent to Australia. So these are big players in the world, and you can't easily just come down with a policy decision and say there are no losers here. So they'll fight those issues. And then finally, our threats are existential. So what's the path forward? We have to overcome those barriers to policy implementation, which means that we need to embrace that uncertainty. But we also need to act knowing that prevention will bring uncertain but positive benefits. And so a reduction in our CO2 emissions, Angie and Tony, we don't know exactly what it'll produce. We don't know exactly how much we need to do. There's all the uncertainty about what our trajectory is and whether we have to take absolute and urgent action by 2035 or 2032 or 2040. But we know that doing something more urgent and more profound now is unequivocally going to be beneficial for health, for economy. The Stern report talked about the economics of it 20 years ago. And so we shouldn't be arguing the fastidious little details when the general understanding in the cloud of uncertainty is that there'll be benefit. We need to recognise and debate that not everyone will benefit. Someone's got to pay as we make these choices for whole of society. But we also need to bring multidisciplinary debate to the fore. These are contested and contestable issues, and there are human values at play as we talk about them, and they're not straightforward. Even if we sometimes act in absolutist ways, as I have done in my public health time, I recognise, and we should all recognise, that there are complex values that are contestable here. Nonetheless, sometimes we come across things and they've got their uncertainty, but there's a pretty straightforward pathway. We live up in the hills, and beautiful king parrots everywhere, and rosellas, and sulphur-crested cockatoos, and currawongs and kookaburras. In Australia, cats are allowed outdoors, except on an exceptional basis, LGA by LGA. Why do we not have a national ban on cats being able to go outdoors? Yes, it's contestable. Yes, we love our little furry creatures, and yes, they're king of the house. But they kill 160 birds a year when they're domestic cats, compared to 450 for feral cats. It's a pretty straightforward equation, even if you can argue around the edges. Salt in our baked beans. If we had a 10% salt reduction, we would reduce strokes in Australia by thousands, literally thousands. We wouldn't notice it because that reformulation could happen over a year or 2 years, but there'd be a few unhappy people who love their salty baked beans. But it's a pretty straightforward equation, despite some of the uncertainties or contested elements. Sugar sweetened beverages, pretty much the same. Reformulation. Actually, Coca-Cola Amatil had this very question in the UK. They were told, you will be taxed at tens of millions of dollars if you don't reduce your formulation. They said, we can't possibly do that. And the reality is they avoided that tax. They reformulated their Coca-Cola. Nobody noticed, and nobody had to pay extra tax because Coca-Cola didn't want to go out and have a higher price on their product. CO2 reduction should be in that space. I don't know what Angie will say about Baku, but there are complex issues, but it shouldn't mean that we are paralysed in our actions for something that is such a profound and urgent and existential threat to our existence. There's my light-hearted end. Thank you very much.